Okay, so this year is dedicated to the success and protection of all the Israeli armed forces, that they destroy the evil barbarian enemy and they're victorious, and there are no casualties and no injuries to our brothers and sisters protecting us, Israel, and all over the world, by the way. Not only the Jews all over the world are also protected by them. So their victory should be swift, and Hashem should protect them and make them victorious.
Amen.
Okay, so continuing with the theme of straightness. Now, there's a sub-chapter here. It's called A Sinner Who Says He Has Done No Wrong. Al-Sheikh HaKodesh also harshly condemns those who are sincerely desirous of pleasing Hashem and following His ways, yet remain blind to the sinfulness of their denigrating attitude toward other people, particularly those who may be different than them in dress or custom. He is particularly critical of those who harden their hearts to the needy, justifying their indifference to suffering by presuming that poverty or disease are afflictions from Hashem, and that it would be an act of rebellion against Hashem to help those whom he condemned. He refers to the story of Turnus Rufus. Now, this is fortuitous that I'm reading it. Turnus, it's actually mentioned in Tisha B'Av. It's one of the Kinot. Turnus Rufus, who was a Roman governor, credited with wreaking the final devastation on Yerushalayim, who challenged Rabbi Akiva in Bava Basra, Tenei, if Hashem loves poor people, why does he not provide for them? According to this Roman tyrant's view, by addressing the ills of society, men such as Rabbi Akiva are perverting the divine will. There is an upright path before a man to prohibit himself from giving his bread to the poor, by saying that since Hashem is angry at him and has withheld bread from him, would it not be considered a violation of the will of the king were he to give him bread to eat? They justify not providing the needy as an act of submission to Hashem's wishes, to have these people stay poor and hungry. It is about the corrupt attitude that Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, at its end are the pathways to death. Perhaps the intention of the verse, for the ways of Hashem are straight, the righteous will walk in them and sinners will stumble in them. And that's Hosea. One may ask why the verse says that the sinners will stumble in them. It should have said they will stumble by not following the ways of Hashem, such as Rashi's interpretation. However, based on the Al-Sheikh, one can interpret the verse to mean that sinners stumble by deluding themselves that their corrupt actions are the ways of Hashem. Such individuals find a good reason to despise and bicker with other people, and in their brazenness claim that this is the will of Hashem.
I think it's
I didn't mean it. That's just paragraph I read. It's just mad that it actually ties in with the theme of Tisha B'Av and Sinat Kenam actually also.
Yeah.
Which led to the destruction of the second temple.
Good, it was fortuitous. Kev, thanks, man. So, guys, just where we left off, there were 10 things that were said about Jerusalem. The first was that a house in Jerusalem is not permanently sold, meaning it wasn't given to any tribe specifically, but in fact, because they're the 3 annual pilgrimage festivals, it had to cater for all Jews, not just exclusively for the Jew that was in there. Generally, we said there was a principle that you could have buyer's remorse up to a year if you sold a house anywhere else in Eretz Israel, and that you could refund the buyer. But there's no such thing in Jerusalem, that you can take back your house at any time and obviously refund back the amount the person paid. So what that means is technically that they paid rent and that they've never really owned a house. And where was this from? Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 29 to 31. So that's where it discusses it. The second concept that we learned was that the city does not bring a calf to be decapitated. What do you mean a calf to be decapitated? Because it's written in the passage in Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 1 that at the end of the day, if a corpse will be found on the land that Hashem your God gives you to possess it, And the author of this statement holds that Jerusalem was not apportioned among the tribes. So what actually happened is that they found a case of a homicide. I think that's probably the best way to put it. And what would happen is if the corpse was from an unwitnessed murder and it's lying in the open, the elders of the town nearest to the corpse must perform a public ritual. What does that ritual involve? Decapitating a calf and declaring their innocence of contributing to the murder. And the Gemara is obviously saying that they can't do that in Jerusalem because it's not as if it's held by any one person, so to speak, conceptually. Now, the third statement is Jerusalem does not become a wayward city. For it's written in that passage, if you hear regarding one of your cities, and Jerusalem was not apportioned among the tribes, hence it cannot be identified as belonging to any one particular tribe. So what we said before, guys, is pretty straightforward, is if you had what is a wayward city? It's a city that basically becomes so spiritually corrupt that most of the citizens are enticed to worship idols. So then the entire city is declared a wayward city, meaning the majority of the citizens have become involved with idol worship. Gavin and I learned this in the end part of Sanhedrin. So what happens is the guilty parties are executed by the sword, as opposed to a lone case of idolatry, where it's either stoning or burning, according to whether you're holding by the rabbis or Rabbi Shimon. But it's one of the most stringent death penalties. As far as en masse is concerned, they're still executed by the sword. Now, you can't use the property because you cannot benefit from any product of Avodah Zorah, and it could be that that property has used either as a house of Avodah Zorah or the contents as almost artifacts that were used within the process itself. So that's destroyed. The city must be razed to the ground and must stay a desolate heap. You're never allowed to rebuild that city. Where do we know this from? Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 13 to 19. It gives all the details there. And the bottom line of it is you can't raze Jerusalem to the ground. You can certainly enforce the death penalty amongst those citizens involved with idol worship. You can certainly confiscate property and burn the property, but you cannot raze Jerusalem to the ground. So that's something to bear in mind. Now, the next point is that Jerusalem is not defiled by Sarah's afflictions, because it's written in the passage, and if you ever look, that's in Leviticus chapter 14, verse 34, that, and I will place a Sarah's affliction upon the house and the land of your possession, and Jerusalem was not apportioned among the tribes. So, guys, since Jerusalem does not qualify as a land of your possession, it's not subject to defilement. In other words, the houses themselves wouldn't become susceptible to tsaras and show that symptomatic decaying and degradation, indicating that the house of a person that had tsaras was also contaminated. So it could appear on the person themselves, on the clothing, but not on the I don't know what the tsaras house looked like. I'm assuming that it probably had some sort of moss or decaying to indicate the spiritual degradation. I also know that it said that in a house that had tsaras, there is treasure in that house afterwards as compensation for the individual that had tsaras. Our question was always on this thing, is that if somebody was poverty-stricken and then they basically spoke Lashon Hora to get tsaras, and their house to get tsaras, their house would be full of precious jewels and gold and silver, whatever, as a result of tsaras. So anybody in a financial predicament would be encouraged to speak Lashon Hora. So I never really got an answer to that. I'm not quite sure what it is. But there probably is an answer. I'm just so bloody ignorant I don't know. So the first statement is explained, and we don't extend beams and balconies in Jerusalem because of the possibility that they will form a tent of tumah. So that's the primary reason, Kevin. It's not injury, as I suggested before. Although the Gemara does bring that injury, especially during the 3 festivals, is something that has to be avoided, because people are quite cramped up and you don't want things jutting out like nails or beams, etc. But the primary reason is that you don't want to have almost an ola, a tent, or some sort of way to contain the tumah. And what's the reason? For the sake of the festival, pilgrims not being injured is a second reason given. So that reason is still valid. That's what the Gemara says. So one way that a person contracts corpse tumah, okay? So tumat mate is when both he and the corpse, or part of the corpse, are found under the same roof and all held like a tent. But it doesn't matter whether it's a bait, a house, or all held. It means that the tumah can't escape. So the rabbis were concerned that a small portion of a corpse, in other words, small enough to be undetected, but large enough, at least in olive size, to contaminate, would be lying on the ground underneath a bank, an area where you couldn't see it, like there could be bags there or whatever. But as long as it was under a tent or a balcony or a house, then people would pass by it and become tameh. So that's the one reason. The other reason is that low-level beams protruding from exterior walls could threaten the safety of pilgrims streaming through the city on their way to the Temple Mount. So they were therefore banned. So anything that could cause injury, both spiritual and physical, that's the bottom line. So, in other words, the Beis Bechira mentions the only reason of contamination could be beams and balconies. That was his specific reason. So the Rambam brought it. So the bottom line is, during the three festivals, as Arthur said the other day, quite rightly, when he brought the example up of the chicken, is that you don't want to create any sort of spiritual contamination through tumah, through like chickens or creatures lifting up a sheretz, through any part of a human being that's more than an olive size but small enough to be undetected, which could create corpse tumah, seminal emission sort of thing, anything that could affect the high level that they were holding on when they went to Jerusalem and they went to the temple to partake of the three festivals. So the last 5 statements are explained. I mean, this is more of a summary. We don't make garbage dumps in Jerusalem because of the creeping creatures. Naturally, anything that is decaying attracts creeping creatures. So again, that's in Leviticus verse 31 of 32 of the same previous chapter. So the rabbis were concerned that basically when those creepy crawlies died, their corpses would become a source of defilement of the sacred offerings brought to Jerusalem. That was explained by Rashi. Now, the other issue, and we do not make kilns in the city because of the smoke. So what are kilns? We used to use kilns when we made pottery. They emit abundance of smoke. I mean, today, when they do a kiln, it doesn't really emanate quite a lot of smoke. But in those days it did, because I think it wasn't that they were cooking a couple of meals or doing a couple of jars of pottery, etc. I think when they're previous to electricity, the amount of the population and the kilns that were used to both create ceramics as well as cook food, etc., were excessive, just based on the number of kilns that there would be. So they would blacken the city wall, and that marred the beauty of Yerushalayim. So the rabbis were also concerned that smoke from the kilns would intermingle with the smoke from the temple sacrificial altar. So that was very interesting, because if you had a look, the spiritual power of the smoke from the temple was so powerful that a woman would not miscarry at all. It had a physical emanation to it. So they didn't want to confuse the two different smells. They wanted it to distinctly have the mental cognizance of knowing it was from a sacrificial altar. It wasn't just about the soot. So now we're dealing with the sichra. So what is sichra? And I'll tell you what it has to do with. We don't create gardens and orchards in the city because of a sichra. So what is that? It's a special sort of stench now, or decaying matter. So there are 2 definitions that Rashi gives. One is that if you maintain a garden, you're involved uprooting and discarding the dead plants and weeds. That's one explanation. The other one is that you need manure if you're going to grow both plants as well as foods, etc. And that's going to mar, the smell of that is going to mar the beauty of the city of Jerusalem. And so any sort of fertilization is going to be a problem. We did say that the garden of roses that had been around since the prophets stayed. And obviously there were certain miracles involved with that where it didn't need that same level of compost. That's also why you don't create garbage dumps, by the way, apart from the little creatures that eat from there. Nobody has a nice smelling garbage dump, I can assure you.
An odor.
There's an odor, exactly, Kevin. And as Arthur said, we do not raise chickens in the city because of the consecrated meat. Because what's going to happen is that if the chickens bring up any sort of sherets or any sort of defilement, you can't then have chickens that become defiled because of the tumor that they've infected themselves. And it's purveying with a sense of tumor. Now, lastly, this is important. You don't keep a corpse overnight in Jerusalem. So there's an oral tradition passed down to us that you've got to bury that exact same day. So, in other words, two questions arise here. Inasmuch as burial on the day of death is universally mandated for Jews, it's not just in Jerusalem. Where's this? In Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23. What does it say, Kev? You shall not leave his body overnight. You shall surely bury him on that day. So the Gemara is saying, well, okay, so that's fine, but why do you limit the requirement to Jerusalem? If the Gemara calls it an oral tradition, that should be for all the areas of Eretz Israel and even abroad in Chutz La'aretz. And, it does say, this was when we were in Mahasha, we learned in Sanhedrin in the 46th and 47th daf, that you can sometimes delay it for the honor of the deceased if a large crowd has to appear and attend the funeral from far off lands. But generally, it has to be an exceptional reason. So the oral tradition comes to teach that in Jerusalem, it's not permitted. In other words, there's no reason that you can delay the burial of Jerusalem. There are no external circumstances. Where in other parts of Israel, there are external circumstances, and especially out of the land of Eretz Israel. That's for sure. So in terms of the applicability of the prohibition nowadays, it's difficult because, as you know, we don't have the temple or any of those things where tumor would be a problem. Secondly, we don't have the paraduma, which could clean corpse tumor, so we're all technically infected. Doesn't give us an excuse for further infecting. I kind of feel like when I'm watching art, I'm watching an arcade game. It's quite something, Art.
I just thought I'd show you what I feel like while I'm writing, what I see.
Wow. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's still missing my face.
Virtual reality.
Virtual reality, exactly. All right. So, guys, let's go on to the next issue. So the Gemara basically returns to the group of rabbinic strictures, they call it. What did we say strictures means? Restrictions. So they were presented in our Mishnah in the 79th daf. So one of the prohibitions, if you remember, is we may not raise pig, swan in any place. So what's the reason for the decree? Well, the Rishonim question why the rabbinic prohibition is necessary, given that doing businesses in forbidden animals is biblically prescribed. Okay? So Rashba explains that the Mishnah speaks of where a person happened to find swan, inherit some. Like when we discussed a case that if a non-Jewish person converts and then they inherit swan, if we make him get rid of it immediately and he has a loss, he'll come to resent Judaism and not drop it. So we give him a bit of a grace period. So generally you would only have it under inheritance if you convert or you happen to find a whole lot of swan that are unclaimed. So under biblical law, you can keep them, but the rabbis required that he sell them off even gradually, But according to Tosfot, the Torah's prohibition applies only to impure animals that are being sold for food. So because we worry that they're sold, we're encouraging Jews to eat treif. So one is permitted, however, to raise and sell swine for their fat, which is used in the manufacture of leather and is smeared into leather to keep it supple. So as long as you're not inducing any pork and you're using it for purely a functional need, it would be allowed. But the rabbis prohibited even that. Why? Not according to Tosfot, but according to that. So it's kind of a debate. But the rabbis did it for a particular reason. When the scions of the royal Hasmonean house besieged one another, Hyrcanus was inside Jerusalem and Aristobulus was outside. So what would happen is every day those in Jerusalem would lower dinner coins in a basket over the city wall, and those outside would send up them lambs for the daily communal sacrifices. Okay, so inside Jerusalem there was an old man who was familiar with Greek wisdom, and one day he said, listen, we can use this surreptitious method of communication. And he said that what happened is because he sympathized with the Greeks and those that were besieging Jerusalem. So he said, look, why don't you put these pigs in a basket, and when the Kohanim would bring them up to sacrifice, it would be within the temple walls, etc., and it would infect that particular area. And in that case, they're not going to have the spiritual upper hand. Okay? So what happens is on the morrow, the Jews inside lowered dinner coins in a basket as usual. But when the besiegers took their cue from the old man, they sent up swine. So once the swine reached the midpoint of the wall, it dug its hooves into the wall, and the land of Israel trembled. So obviously, in an area of 400 pasas by 400 pasas, and at that time the rabbis declared, cursed be the man who raises swine, and cursed be the person who teaches his son Greek wisdom. So we've got to understand what this means. Some of it was literal and some of it was figurative, explaining a physical representation of the spiritual reality. Okay? So who was Hyrcanus and Aristobulus? They were the sons of Alexander Yanai, who was the son of Yochanan Hyrcanus, son of Shimon, son of Matithyahu Kohen Gadol. So Queen Alexandra Salome ruled after the death of her husband, Alexander Yanai. So when she died, the crown should have passed her and gone to the first son, okay, that was born, and that was Hyrcanus. But the second born son, Aristobulus, refused to concede the throne to his older brother. So there was a whole civil war. So each faction sought to enlist the Roman general Pompey in its cause. Now Pompey eventually besieged and entered Jerusalem, and thus began the Roman dominion of Judah. Now, do you remember what happened to Pompey, guys?
The actual general or the island of
The island of Pompeii, do you remember?
Blew up, I think. There was a volcano there.
Yes, God was patient.
There's a volcano there.
He leveled the place with a volcano. It killed every inhabitant there on the island, exactly. Okay, so Hyrcanus held Jerusalem, and Aristobulus was encamped around the city with the Roman legions under Pompey. So he had enlisted in his cause. The two brothers were against each other. Obviously, Hyrcanus was outside and Aristobulus was inside. And what happens is coins were taken from the temple treasury, and the Jews of Aristobulus' faction would use them to purchase animals for korbanos, for sacrifices. So the daily sacrifices must be purchased with shekalim, which were coins that were collected annually from every adult Jewish male, and they were stored in a special chamber in the temple complex. Okay? So basically, how did this whole sort of shenanigan take place? There was a cryptic and elusive language spoken by members of the royal household. It was like a Greek code, and it wasn't normal Greek. It was indecipherable by the masses. And why they wanted to spiritually sabotage this is they knew that divine protection from Hashem would help the Jewish people and obviously help the one brother who sided with the Jewish people compared to the others. So what happens is that when swine accidentally came up instead of lambs, that upset the king of the universe, as it says, Sota, which smoldered the desecration of his name. So apparently when it said a passer shook the thousands of, or 400 passes squared, okay, it's squared, it's not just in one direction, it meant that there was going to be a spiritual consequence as a result. So the Ben Yoda avers that this curse, it should have been uttered first, because it was the old man's Greek wisdom that precipitated the sending up of a pig. So he explains that the casual effect didn't become known until later, after the swine curse was declared. So in other words, they make a juxtaposition between the curse of the swine as well as the curse of Greek wisdom. Kev, you look exhausted, man.
I'm fine. I'm wide awake, but I'm tired. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't closed my eyes.
Yeah. So I'm saying there was a juxtaposition. They said what caused this cleverness wasn't, in other words, the actual fact was the spiritual infection within the temple area and sacrificial area that would have been caused. I don't think it was actually caused. It seems to have been stopped midway, that they had an intuition that something was wrong. But that in itself led a very strict rabbinical code that swine in particular, I think it's because they exhibit one kosher sign and pretend to be kosher, which is far more sinister than a full-on treif animal. It's that concept where many Jewish people, or many people, pretend to be more frum and kosher than they are, when in fact the midos are not really holding at a proper even minimum level. So it's the hypocrisy that's actually brought forward of pretending to be kosher when you treif, where often what happens is the surreptitious nature, especially when you have it, is that liberal Jews will create problems where they side with the Palestinians, and they say these halachic ordinances are from like hundreds of years ago, they're archaic, they're no longer valid, etc. These sort of things damage us more than external people that generally don't interfere with Judaism in and of itself. So the swine was cursed, anybody that owns them, anybody that raises them, but the concept itself remains a factor that anything deviating from Torah and trying to become kosher, or pretending to be kosher, under the guise of, I'll give you an example. There's a certain rabbi that turns around and says you have to love your fellow man, and therefore we have to embrace LGBTQ and homosexual behavior. When in fact in Leviticus it says that the prohibition of homosexuality is so stringent it gets the death penalty, because it's an abomination in the eyes of Hashem. So what they do is they take a corrupt concept like love your fellow man and accept your fellow man, and they corrupt the concept of what Hashem's tolerance level is and what he's prepared to tolerate and not. So you've got that as an issue. And why they make that akin to Greek wisdom is that Greek wisdom is very much where we're living today. So, for example, it was very interesting that Rabbi Blachman, who's been speaking at the base.
Yeah.
Did you hear him, Kevin? By the
Bits
way?
and pieces. Yeah.
So he was saying, and I think it's important to Tisha B'Av, even for obviously on this night, even if we end a few minutes early, is that we're living in an era of Greek wisdom. Why? Because we say we want the Beis HaMikdash rebuilt, but many of us couldn't handle it. Firstly, we have no idea what that means. The fact of it is the concept of jihad, for example, is very much a Judaic concept. Like if we look at the era Nidachas, the city that's gone wayward, you're killing everybody and you're burning the place down. So if you're killing everybody and burning the place down, that's jihad. In other words, if you don't accept a certain ideology, one dies for it. That's the concept of jihad. Now, to us, at the moment, it's completely foreign. And since it's completely foreign, it would seem that that is an extreme approach. But in fact, under certain laws, it's a Jewish approach. If you're not going to serve Hashem and you're going to serve idols, one deserves the death penalty. But that seems like jihad. If you don't accept our particular religious philosophy, we're going to kill you. So what I'm saying is the Greek mind, at which we have today, hasn't got a concept of understanding what it means. You can come through with pleasure. Hi, how are you? Good, come through with pleasure. Come have a look. So the bottom line of it is this sense of wanting. Come with pleasure. Sure. So the concept is reiterated now, where you're not going to have any sense. You're not going to have any sense of understanding what that loss means, because we're not living within that mindset. We're living within a mindset of Yavani in any event. It's not changing. So what we're hoping for is the feeling and understanding of what we've lost. Basically, as Rabbi Goldschmidt said, we spoke last time, it's like a lion that grows up in captivity. There's no idea what freedom means, like in game reserve. There's no concept of it. It's an idea of it, but not experientially. So, so guys, listen, I'm going to end off on that. We can carry on with the Gemara share tomorrow. You can ask me questions.
Jihad actually means, even in some of the Muslims, where they walked ideas, it means fighting from within, perfecting the war from within yourself, to perfect yourself. It's a war, not your enemy or someone who you're intolerant of. That's what the actual meaning of jihad is. It means fighting from within yourself and perfecting yourself. I mean, we all need to do this. That's what they've perverted the actual meaning of it. That's what I heard this in the show, actually. That's what it means.
Correct. Correct. And it's interesting because, brought that up was the Rambam's son, who became the health minister of Egypt. He took over from his father, and he was talking about asceticism, where actually to almost seclude yourself away from standard drives and attractions within the secular world was about character development. And this concept of asceticism and jihad were in certain cases of history where Jews and Muslims had a lot more in common than Jews and Christians, just in terms of lack of avodah zarah and certain other restraints, even sniut. I mean, today it's a bit of a farce, the way they've applied it, but at its concept, it was very similar to Judaism in terms of modesty. But the bottom line of it is it's very difficult to connect with the concept of Tisha B'Av, where we want it to be back to the stage where you've got the court system, which would give lashes, as Rabbi Blachman said, which would put hot metal down a person's throat, and certain other death penalties, or even, for example, the concept of stoning somebody for their sexual behavior is something that's very foreign to the Western and Greek mind. It's something that naturally we feel an aversion towards because it feels barbarically extreme. And that's the fact and the tragedy of being in Galut, that we don't know what it's like to understand it, kindness in terms of its contextual relevance. So I just wanted to bring that.
And could it be considered cruelty, you mean?
Correct, by the Western mind. So he said we infected with Greek wisdom and understanding. Most of like you, Kev.
I spoke to someone many years ago. Remember when they found Saddam Hussein, the Yamach Shemor, in a bunker with these billions of dollars in notes and US dollar bills? Remember they found him, he had a beard, he looked all haggard and he was disheveled. Remember they found him?
Yes.
And someone in Joburg, a friend of my sister-in-law's, you don't know who this is, again?
Yeah. No, I do. So I'll block my ears. Okay.
Anyway, so she said, some of these people, excellent, but we all blinded in some way or other. So she says, no, they mustn't kill him. It's evil. It's barbaric. The guy he butchered over 1 million people. You mustn't give him the death sentence. It's evil, terrible. What more? How else would you deal with somebody like that? He must be locked up for 50 years at the taxpayer's expense in prison, get cable TV and get a degree, and have a great life. That's the least he deserved, was a death sentence.
Yeah, so exactly, that's misdirected kindness. So if you're kind to the cruel, you're being cruel to the kind. That's exactly it. And I never understood this concept of Batman. So what happens is he catches people and he lets them go. And he catches the bad people and he lets them go. I've never understood why he just doesn't remove them from the world. I'm serious. This is the concept of Batman that I don't understand.
And it's happening in some American cities now. With these, some of they arrest people, violent criminals, and they let them out the day later. And they repeat criminals, and they terrorize, and especially in these Democrat-run cities. It's a disgrace. That's a basic.
One person was arrested, I think, 50 times.
Yeah.
Lost like 5 years.
One of the
and
basic.
Comes out the next day and
does it again.
That's why they continue.
And because they're too lazy to do it's just left, and that's evil. It's like the basic fundamental of Sheva mitzvahs b'nai Noach. After that, they're not even running a justice system properly.
Yeah, so DeSantis in Florida,
brilliant, superb.
Fired.
I saw that. Yes, DeSantis. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the senior prosecutors for not
because he
following
was
the law.
woke.